Welcome to today's webinar, Cool Classrooms on a Budget, How Federal Energy Tax Credits Can Help. My name is Sara Ross. I'm a co-founder of Undaunted K-12, a national nonprofit working to ensure that every student has the opportunity to learn in school buildings that are safe, healthy, and resilient. We're here to talk about HVAC systems. HVAC stands for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. This is a core building system and a very important ingredient in safe, healthy, and resilient schools. I'm so happy to be joined by a knowledgeable and experienced set of speakers. Ron Fues is a project director at McKinstry with nearly 30 years of experience in mechanical engineering, energy performance contracting, and building systems design. Thanks, Ron, for being here. Taylor Vick is a capital projects mechanical coordinator at Seattle Public Schools. He uses his expertise in building operations, mechanical systems, and facilities coordination to support the district's facilities. Thanks, Taylor. And then Kira Wilmess is a program coordinator at Lawyers for Good Government, helping to advance and protect clean energy legislation nationwide. Okay, so let's jump in with some very quick context setting here. We all know that the climate is changing and rising temperatures mean buildings need to respond. It is not business as usual for our buildings. And in our schools, this is particularly important as many of our school buildings were not built with cooling. We know young bodies are particularly vulnerable to heat. We also know that the classroom environment, including temperature, really deeply affects learning, cognition, really the core mission of schools. Second, we know that many HVAC systems, in our schools and probably more broadly in buildings are in need of replacement and repair. We know that old systems can be a significant drain on maintenance staff's time and their budget. So we know that many communities are likely planning to make upgrades here. And this webinar is, really going to help you in your decision-making and choices there. And lastly, we know that the choices that building owners make around HVAC systems can either contribute to air pollution and subject us to new and evolving regulations around buildings, or those choices can actually reduce air pollution and set us up to comply with those emerging regulations. So that's just some of the big picture table setting for this conversation about ground source heat pumps, a modern HVAC solution that we're excited to explore with you all today. We're talking about schools here, and that was certainly the framing, but I will also say that this technology and these tax credits are available for all sorts of buildings. So if you're someone who also thinks about libraries or police stations, other municipal buildings, or if you're a commercial building owner in general, all of this can really apply. So let's dig in. First, introduce this technology. I'm excited to pass it over to Ron. Thanks for being here, Ron.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Yes, so going to cover this really fast. This is just a very high level, 12 to 15 minutes to level set on ground source heat pumps, what they are, when you might install them, and then why consider ground source heat pumps versus other technologies that are out there to provide heating and or cooling. Okay, great. Okay, so for when to install HVAC, unlike something like LED lighting where it might have a return on investment to replace lighting that's not end of life, typically for HVAC, the time when you're going to upgrade HVAC is either when you need to add HVAC to something new or when the HVAC that you have is end of life. So the first example there, it's not a K-12 example, but as an example of a building that was being converted from one use to another use. So it was being converted from daycare into classrooms, and that necessitated the need to rethink the HVAC for that building. And then that building ended up going with heat pumps. It was actually air source heat pumps for that one. The slide in the middle there is probably something everyone's familiar with, a very old steam boiler that's at the end of its life, and it's time to think about what's next. And for that school in Seattle, one of the options being considered is ground source heat pumps to replace that steam boiler. And then end-of-life cooling is another opportunity. We'll get into this more, but equipment that can do cooling, it could also be a heat pump because the technology for cooling is the same as the technology for heat pumps. So this next slide here, some of you may have seen this before, but it's a really good example of how you use the earth for heat transfer. So think of the earth as a battery that stays at a relatively neutral temperature. So in the wintertime, it's very easy to pull heat out of the earth and put it into the building using heat pumps. And in the summer, because the temperature is very moderate, it's very easy to push heat out of the building into the earth. So in lieu of cooling tower or a boiler, you can use the earth. Typically, you're circulating fluid through heat exchangers. And then you can do heating and cooling from one system. And we'll get more into that, but there are a lot of schools in Washington State that do not have cooling. And this is a way to solve your heating problems and also get something that you didn't have before by adding cooling. And then the other advantage is electricity in Washington State is very clean. So it's a way to switch to a clean fuel versus natural gas. So there's another benefit there is to use electricity as the fuel. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we could probably have 10 slides on different options with ground source heat pumps. HVAC is very complex, but just to break it down to the really high level, outside the building, you can have open loop or closed loop. So those are the two big categories, and that's the big decision. So closed loop is more common, and that's where you have that plastic piping, and you might have hundreds of loops of plastic piping going down a couple hundred feet, circulating water in closed loop plastic piping. And then open loop is a little bit less common, but it's becoming more common and can, if your site is right, can have a lot of cost savings. So it can be cheaper to do open loop than closed loop. So that's one reason to consider that. And then inside the building, the two big choices are centralized or distributed. So centralized, you might have 2 heat pumps, either right outside the building or inside the boiler room. And then for a distributed system, you might have 50 or 200 heat pumps throughout the building. So that's the distributed. And then the other big consideration is, do you want to have water piping throughout your building or refrigerant piping throughout your building? Very high level choices there. Okay, and then why might you consider doing this? I've already mentioned adding cooling. In some cases, you can reduce noise because with ground source, you typically would have the compressorized equipment inside a mechanical room rather than somewhere where it could be, near classrooms or outside by a play field. So you can reduce noise, and then adding cooling is probably the #1 benefit. And then also they have a very long lifespan. So of all the different HVAC system types, except maybe, something like an old school, really old boiler, nothing's going to outlast a ground source heat pump system. That's a big advantage. Lower operating cost. So you might have access to, to a capital levy or a capital bond. This is a way to spend that money and then have lower operating cost, for decades. And lower operating cost benefits the classroom. And then maintenance staff. So, like that steam boiler picture that I showed, some of these old systems are just very maintenance intensive for districts that do not have a lot of maintenance staff. And then I will mention the Clean Building Performance Standard and the Washington State Energy Code. Those are very easy to comply with a ground source heat pump. So ground source heat pumps are extremely efficient. and they use electricity, not natural gas, which pairs very well with those, the Energy Code and the Clean Building Performance Standard. Eliminating natural gas, eliminating natural gas eliminates a risk, and that's an advantage. And then this last one only applies if you're comparing air source heat pumps to ground source heat pumps, is ground source heat pumps are not affected by outdoor air temperature. So it could be -5 degrees outside. Ground source heat pump doesn't notice because it's not interacting with the outdoor air. It's interacting with the ground, which is a stable temperature. Okay. So this kind of relates back to Sarah's slide on more and more schools are seeing that there's an advantage of adding cooling. This is a temperature trend from 1950 through 2020. You've got Eastern Washington, Western Washington. Certainly Western Washington is cooler than Eastern Washington during hot weather, but they're both trending upwards over time. So it could be when the school was built in 1960, it didn't need cooling, but now it does. Okay. Oh, I had mentioned that ground source heat pumps are extremely efficient. What you can see on the bar on the left, that's the ground source heat pump. And this is the energy use per square foot of school, like a 50,000 square foot elementary, for example. And this is just for the heating that we're looking at here. So ground source heat pumps are the best. There's nothing better. Air source heat pumps are also good. And then gas is the worst. And then electric resistance is better than gas, but you'll see when we get to the cost slide that electric resistance has a big problem with it. Okay. Carbon intensity, similarly, Washington has a very clean grid. Depending on who your utility is, it might vary a little bit. This is based on the statewide average for Washington State. Again, ground source heat pumps are the best for carbon. Air source heat pumps are next. Gas is the worst. Okay, and then utility cost, that's where you see electric resistance and gas switch places. And that's because even though the gas is the least energy efficient option, the cost to buy natural gas is a bit lower than the cost to buy electricity. So that's why electric resistance uses more heat. More cost. So electric resistance, think of it as the element in your toaster that just heats up with electricity, not a heat pump. Okay, next slide. So what this is showing here is that one really common question that school districts ask is, well, if we're adding cooling, isn't that going to defeat the purpose of saving energy? Because before the cooling didn't exist, so it was free, and now we're spending energy on heating our own cooling. And that is true, but as you can see, the penalty to do the cooling is a lot less than the amount of energy you're going to save through the heat pump. So it eats into your savings a little bit, but you get cooling and you're still net ahead on your utility cost and your utility use. Okay. And then slide on safety here. So carbon monoxide, there are a few districts that have policies of, no classroom gas furnaces, for example. And, it's pretty rare that there are issues, but there are news stories that, every now and then that do happen across the country where there are issues with carbon monoxide in schools. And gas explosions, extremely rare, but they do happen. So some districts see that as a liability reduction. Okay. And then we have some examples here. The photo on the left is project we just did for open loop ground source in Ocosta. And this gives a good example of, for an open loop system, you really just see, in this case, there were 3 wells, and this is what the top of the well looks like. So it looks kind of like a fire hydrant. So imagine a school campus with 3 of these on it. So it's very space. It does not take up much space. And then for closed loop, it takes up a lot more space, but then it gets covered with something like a play field or a soccer field or landscaping. This second site here is not K-12, but it is Washington State, and that's the public health lab, and that is a water-to-water heat pump. So water-to-water heat pumps look a lot like boilers, but there's no combustion air, there's no flue. It's just an electric piece of equipment inside a mechanical room. And then, yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ron. Taylor, we're excited to bring you on and talk about Seattle Public Schools and how you all have incorporated this technology into your facilities pretty diligently and regularly for many years now. So welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Ron. Really good information. Yeah, excited to share our journey here at Seattle Public Schools. So yeah, I'm Taylor Vick, an MEP coordinator with capital projects and planning, and I straddle our facilities and our planning department and make sure that we have energy efficient standards in our mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our newer buildings and the history of heat pumps here at SPS. For anybody who's unfamiliar with the district, we have 106 educational facilities. We have about 120 sites throughout the region. 106 are schools. You see the breakdown here. It's a little bit less than 11 million square feet in total. And we have about 7 building engineers that maintain our portfolio on a daily basis. So we'll get into that in a second here. But our enrollment is right around 50,000 with an annual budget of about $1.2 billion. And for anybody who's interested, our average UI is 29.3. So we're trying to even push that even lower as we move along here. On this slide, there's a picture here of Kimball Elementary School. This is in the Beacon Hill neighborhood here in Seattle. And you'll see that it's an urban school district, so we're dealing with a lot of really tight, dense sites. But what you can't see behind this building is actually the playfield where our ground loop for this facility is located. So we'll kind of talk about that here in a second. So next slide, Sarah. So throughout the district, I just wanted to kind of give a brief breakdown here of the different types of mechanical systems we have. And you'll see that 50% in the blue here is hydronic hot water heating. So we have mostly hydronic systems. The yellow is slight bit of steam that we have left from early 1900s facilities. And then in the light green, we have our ground source loops. So we have about 19 sites right now that have ground source heat pumps. And then the darker green is just distributed heat pumps, like Ron was mentioning, a heat pump per classroom. So this is just really to give you an idea of how we've standardized our mechanical systems and how we're kind of fitting heat pumps into existing or new hydronic facilities. So next slide, Sarah. All right, so a brief history of heat pumps here at SPS. We've been using heat pumps since the 1980s. It's a really reliable technology for us. And in fact, some of the buildings that were built originally with heat pumps are still operating with those original heat pumps. So it's really, like Ron was mentioning, it's a testament to their durability as just general machinery. And we actually installed our first ground source system in 2012. We retrofitted a middle school over in West Seattle and added ground source again to a large playfield. We had the space for that. And our newer standards, our newer buildings in the most recent iteration of construction, we're moving away from our distributed systems where we have heat pumps in every classroom or every common area, right? Moving those towards a centralized system and maintaining a hydronic loop that goes around the building and serves air handlers and fin tube radiators and things like that. And this is for a couple of reasons. One, it's a lot less space that we have to designate for mechanical systems, so the architects really like that. And then second, it really reduces the number of individual machines that we have to maintain. So while distributed systems are really efficient and really easy to schedule and control, they become a lot to maintain over time, especially if you have a large high school that has 150 or 200 heat pumps. It's just a lot. So it also kind of reduces our refrigeration footprint as well. So we have less refrigerant that we're dealing with, and it's easier to maintain. And then the last 2 points here, right? We have a fossil fuel free initiative from the school board that we must be fossil fuel free by 2040. So heat pumps play a really important role in that because we are now building all electric buildings supported by heat pumps and ground source loops. And then as Ron touched on, these are really great ways to meet building energy performance standards and clean building performance requirements for both the city of Seattle and the state of Washington as a whole. So we're excited to be pioneering some of this technology as well. So next slide. And so, as I mentioned, we have 19 sites now on ground loops, but we have a good maybe 65%, or I'm sorry, 45% of the district using heat pumps. And for us, we really appreciate the simple sort of architecture of the system. It's, two pipes, water, and a compressor, more or less, right? So it's really easy for us with a really constrained staff of 7 building engineers to be able to go into any facility and be able to service that facility. Everything is consistent and standardized, and that's really what we're trying to aim for at a high level. But heat pumps really make that possible because every heat pump, whether it's a water furnace or a climate master or whatever, they all operate in sort of the same fashion. So for us, having that standardization is really key for the efficiency of operations as well. And they're highly efficient, right? They're all electric. We can have a single utility serving the building and get really good return on that utility cost. And with our shift towards a centralized model and a centralized plant, where previously a distributed system, we would have issues where if you have a classroom heat pump that goes down and you can't get parts or you have a leak or something like that, you have a classroom that can't maintain the proper temperature and you might have to move people out of that space. So for us, the move towards a sort of simplified central plant was really around redundancy and diversity in the system. So we can take a machine offline and still have the rest of the facility operate normally without actually any indication that there's an issue, right? So we prefer this over any other type of system like VRF or distributed heat pumps as they were, just because we get more reliability in that way. And then as I mentioned, right, the fewer machines we have, the more centralized they are, the fewer moving pieces we have to deal with, right? So fewer pumps, fewer compressors, things like that. And then that gives us that smaller refrigeration footprint. So we're doing less reporting to the EPA and we're replacing refrigerant less often and things like that. So we see a big benefit to those centralized type systems. And then the last bullet point here, we've been focusing a lot of our newer buildings are all ground source heat pumps where they can be. But now we're moving some of our existing hydronic sites into these heat pump implementations. And so it's really easy to take an existing gas boiler and replace it with a couple heat pumps that serve the same purpose. And we can get those clean energy benefits without really having to do a lot of work in the building. So we see a lot of benefit going down the road as well for our existing sites. And then, of course, every system is going to have its constraints and its cons, right? So in our newer buildings, it's really easy to build in space and equipment locations for our central plants. But oftentimes, especially in our existing buildings, we have boiler rooms or mechanical plants that are much smaller. And so you might have space constraints within the building if you have to add additional pieces of equipment. But another big consideration for us as an urban district is land space and real estate. So we have a couple sites that we would love to put heat pumps and ground source loops in, but it's over a train tunnel or something like that. So we just literally don't have the ground space to use there. So, but again, we can use a different type of heat pump to serve those spaces. And then the other thing to consider is just the serviceability. You have to have special refrigeration equipment and special licensing to handle refrigeration. So where you might have not had to have any certifications to do work in your building before, you might have to consider that if you're installing heat pumps for the first time. And then around serviceability as well, just making sure you have a spacious place that you generally need to access all 4 or 5 sides of the equipment. So it's important to have space available. And that's one of the benefits of a centralized system. Now, instead of working in a closet with a heat pump up against a wall, we have a lot more space in these plants to work with this equipment. So it's really nice to have that as well. And then just some considerations as well for the different types of, or the heat pumps generate water at a lower temperature. So they're not going to be as effective in an older building where you have systems designed for 160 or 180 degree hydronic hot water. You might not be able to retrofit the same type of equipment in those spaces. So just consider that if you're looking to add heat pumps to an existing building. We're looking at some situations here at SPS where we want to put in and get rid of our gas boilers and put in heat pumps, but the building is designed with loop temperatures that are much warmer than we could produce with a heat pump, right? So what are the options there? So some things to consider, they're not always a like for like or one for one replacement. And then the last 2 points here, right? We especially right now, this time of year, we're having issues with our shoulder seasons where it's can be challenging to switch plants from heating to cooling mode effectively, right? So seasonal changeover can be a little bit more challenging because you have both pieces of heating and cooling equipment combined into one. So that changeover can be a little more challenging. And then with that comes a little bit more complex controls as well, right? So you have to be able to maintain a loop temperature and your ground loop temperature and all of those things. And then staging heat pumps and other things, integration, all of that are things to consider, right? It's not as simple as an on and off in the plant anymore, right? And so we're looking at different ways that we can ease some of those complexities as well with different types and sizes of machines. So we can run different loads in the shoulder season versus full on heating or cooling seasons as well. So just some other considerations if you're adding to an existing building. So overall, we've had a lot of success with operating our plants, and they're really simple. They're really easy to maintain. And we really have had a lot of benefit and a lot of efficiency in our operations, if you will, right? Because everything has kind of been simplified. So we're really excited about how we can fit some of these heat pumps into our existing buildings. That's kind of our next focus. But overall, we've been really happy with the performance and the results that we've gotten out of our new facilities. So I think this was my last slide, if I'm not wrong. Yep. So again, I'm really excited to be presenting this to you guys. I'm always available if anybody wants to look at one of our plants or talk more about how operations are going for us. Happy to have that conversation as well. So thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Taylor. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing the firsthand experience as a small team trying to conquer 106 buildings. You certainly have your hands full. So thank you for making time for this.
Of course.
So you got introduced to the technology by Ron, so a little bit something about ground source heat pumps. You've seen how Seattle is really finding a lot of benefits to bringing them into their facilities and standardizing this equipment. Now let's talk a little bit about a federal funding opportunity that can reduce the cost of deploying this technology in your facilities. So there is federal funding to really bring down those upfront costs. It's called the Investment Tax Credit, and it's available for all projects that start anytime between now and the end of 2034. The tax credit is generally equal to about 30% of what you spend on to install a ground source heat pump, but could be as much as 50%. We'll talk a little bit more about that, how you can maximize your tax credit. And it's available in all locations across Washington. So all locations can do this in all contexts. You can do it in the new construction projects or some of the renovation projects that Ron and Taylor were talking about. Schools and other non-taxable entities turn this into cash using something called elective pay. It's going to arrive as a check in your mailbox as a reimbursement. So this opportunity, this package, this tax credit and this elective pay reimbursement opportunity were created by the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. And the Budget Reconciliation Bill, also known as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that you may have heard about, did nothing to restrict or reduce the availability of this tax credit for ground source heat pumps. So important to understand that this is still very much an opportunity. Again, we're talking about schools, but this is available for all commercial buildings. This funding works a little bit differently. If you haven't touched a tax credit before, it works a little bit differently than other, certainly federal funding sources and even some state funding sources with which you may be more familiar. So important to note this is a non-competitive source of funding, and it is uncapped, meaning as many schools across Washington, as many buildings across Washington, across the country, in fact, that install this technology they're eligible to claim this tax credit. If you install it, you get it. It is uncapped for you as a building owner. It is uncapped overall. So for as many buildings across the country as do this, the IRS is on the hook to pay out these tax credits. And it's mandatory spending. So mechanically, how this is working is it's treated like an overpayment of taxes and you are due a refund. So this is mandatory spending on behalf of the IRS that's uncapped. So important that this behaves very differently than a grant. And what these features say to me is that folks can build a strategy around how to make the most of this uncapped, non-competitive source of funding over the next several years. Again, we have this time span until 2034 to start projects. So really, we can start to move towards this. And it is important, again, because it's not a grant. One of your pieces of planning and strategizing that you need to do is from a cash perspective, because this is a reimbursement. It comes to you after you install the technology. And again, it comes to you as cash if you're a non-taxable entity like a school. So how do you figure out what the size of this tax credit is going to be? Just so you can, get some rough estimates here, is based on the cost that you spend to install this equipment. And we'll talk a little bit about the cost basis, as it's called. You apply that a certain percentage, that's your credit percentage. And we'll talk about kind of this notion of base and bonus credits. So think of it as a base, how much you spent times a percentage. That's generally the credit amount. There might be some adjustments if you get a big grant also for this equipment, if you pay for it with tax-exempt financing. Those are some details we won't get into today, but there might be some small adjustments around the margin. But this is the general kind of formula for how you figure out how much this tax credit can be worth. So on that first piece, how much did you spend? Well, what's the what that we're talking about here? In other words, what are the eligible costs? And in the case of a ground source system, it's everything from that piping in the ground that Ron and Taylor were talking about, all the way through as it enters the building and we do some heat exchange work, and then all the way through all the distribution equipment to bring it around to all those classrooms. You're seeing pictures here of the air diffusers at the floor of a classroom or some radiant panels. So all that equipment is all part of what they call the eligible cost basis. You can either even apply some percentage of your design costs to do this work. So it's a really quite expansive definition of eligible costs. Everything you need to make that system operational, essentially. So that's that first piece. How much did we spend? And then it's, that credit percentage that we talked about, and there are ways that you can maximize that. And there are a few key concepts that will be useful for you to understand as you enter this work that can help you maximize your credit amount. First is some labor standards. For certain larger projects over 1 megawatt, there's going to be a strong incentive for projects to pay the federal prevailing wage and to incorporate the use of apprentices in these programs. That will make sure that you're maximizing your credit. So that's one piece. And in some cases, there will be some strong incentives around labor standards. Seattle did this work and incorporated apprentices in their work. And then for certain communities, there will be an extra 10% just based on where the project is located. Those are called energy communities. That's a term of art associated with this legislation. And there's certainly parts of Washington that are energy communities. Brownfields are also considered energy communities. So if you're doing work on a brownfield, that can yield a higher percentage of reimbursement. And then the last piece is what's called domestic content. So this is about where we're getting our bits and pieces from. Are we sourcing 100% of our steel and iron from American manufacturers? Are we sourcing a certain percentage of our manufactured products that are going to be part of this ground source heat pump system? Are those coming from domestic manufacturers? This is a little bit different than Buy America, Build America, otherwise known as BABA, if you've heard of that. So this is, also the federal government caring about where you buy things from. And yet it's a little bit different than BABA. So important to understand that, but spiritually similar. So those are 3 ways that you can maximize your credit. And what that ends up looking like is a base credit of 30%. And then adders if you use domestic content, and another adder if you're located in an energy community. And that's how we get up to a 50% reimbursement on a ground source heat pump project. So a very simple example, if your ground source heat pump project cost you $10 million and you qualified for that base rate of 30%, you'd get an estimated $3 million credit back as a reimbursement. Really simple example. As I mentioned before, larger projects, so over 1 megawatt, you might hear ground source heat pumps referred to size in terms of tonnage. And so if you're over 284 tons, that's that 1 megawatt equivalence, you will need to meet some labor standards, that prevailing wage and apprenticeship piece that we talked about, to achieve that base of 30% and to qualify for those 10% adders. Otherwise, we're going to go down to that 6% and those lower percentages. So again, important to understand whether you are doing a large project over 1 megawatt or a small project under 1 megawatt. And we typically see that break happen somewhere around 125,000 square feet of building is typically where we see that happen. But you would talk to your engineers to figure that out. So let's look at a specific example from our friends here in Seattle. You all were among the school districts, because you had already been installing ground source. You were one of the first school districts in line across the country. You all had installed ground source heat pumps in Kimball, Viewlands, and James Baldwin. The cost basis, how much, these were new school construction projects, but the amount that was associated with your ground source is listed there on the cost basis. You all were able to receive 40% back from those costs back because you did incorporate domestic content. So 40% of that cost basis will yield you the tax credits of 2.4, 2.5, 2.69 million. And they received a $7.9 million check from 1 year worth of work. And as Seattle continues to install more ground source, they will continue to be able to access and receive these reimbursements. Again, it is reimbursement, so they did this work in advance. They filed with the IRS on November 13th of 2024, and then received that check on December 9th, 2024. So a pretty quick turnaround. In general, the IRS seeks to pay out within 45 days, and then interest starts ticking. So it's a pretty quick turnaround, but you do have to wait till you're all installed. So that reimbursement piece. Okay, so I hope that's given you a little flavor of tax credits as a reliable and really valuable funding source for installing this modern HVAC technology. If this is all new to you from a technology perspective, and maybe new to others within your school district that you'd want to consider this technology, you can use our resources here, HVAC Choices for Student Health and Learning. This really lays out a framework for how kind of a non-technical audience, so think school board member, think superintendent, think other members of the leadership team, how they might think about how these HVAC choices can align up with their objectives. We have a great one-pager here which overviews this tax credit opportunity, really quick one-pager that you could be taking in and distributing around to leadership teams. And then we have a new guide coming out in the next few weeks that'll get into the nitty-gritty of how district teams can maximize their ability to claim this tax credit. So some great resources there. We also have a bunch of digital resources, case studies, videos, other webinars that we've done on our website. So check out our Energy Tax Credits Hub. And we also have some blog posts on the National Center on School Infrastructure webpage. So lots of good details there and learning resources so the learning can continue. You all in Washington are particularly, so we do this work across the country, and you all in Washington are particularly lucky because your state Department of Commerce has provided additional extra resources to support communities in taking advantage of these tax credits. So I'm so excited to have Kira here to explain more of what the Department of Commerce offers its communities to take advantage of this. So Kira, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, my name's Kira. I am one of the program coordinators helping out with SETCAP. So what is this? The Washington Clean Energy Tax Credit Assistance Program is fully funded by the Department of Commerce, and we can provide free legal and technical assistance to entities in Washington state. So, schools like yourself, tribes, local governments, churches, and we can help you access these tax credits for your clean energy projects. So we can help you apply all the information that Sarah just shared around elective pay to your specific project. And so we partner with Giraffe Financial and Advise and Legal to provide this service completely at no cost to you. And so next slide. We've got 3 main service tracks that we prioritize. And so when you're ready to get assistance, we can meet with your organization for a short 30-minute intake call. And so for Ready to Learn, this is for those who are curious about how elective pay can support your organization. And so we discuss general information around the tax credits. And so, everybody should be an expert here after Sarah's presentation, but we are happy to provide a refresher and, share specific guidance about, guidance briefs, additional resources to help increase your knowledge on elective pay. So for Ready to Plan, this is if you are already, planning on a ground source heat pump project or, a different project like solar. We can help you review documentation or grants for your project and help make sure that you're eligible for these elective pay credits and that you have everything you need to get started. And so we can meet with you for one-on-one technical assistance calls throughout the course of your project lifespan. So, set up recurring calls with our attorneys, and all this is at no cost to you. So the last service track, Ready to File, we partner with Giraffe Financial, and they are a full-service accounting firm that really specializes in these elective pay credits. So if you have already completed a clean energy project or you completed your ground source heat pumps, we can get you in contact with them to help you with the entire filing process, all the way from completing the pre-registration forms, filing an extension, and all the way up to e-filing on your behalf for the credit. They can also help with things like cost segregation analysis and reviewing documentation related to your project as well. And so I think that is my last slide, but I did want to mention that we have SETCAP office hours. So in those, they are bi-weekly. We actually have the next one coming up this Wednesday at noon Pacific time. And so we discuss generally some of the information about elective pay that was mentioned here, along with some of the other technologies that are eligible and certain, new restrictions and requirements around that. And we can also help you answer general elective pay questions on those office hours as well. And so, yeah, if you are interested in taking advantage of this free service, you can fill out an intake form, and that link should be coming up soon. But we welcome anyone and everyone to take advantage of this free service funded by Commerce. But that's it for me, and I'll pass it to you, sir.
Thanks, Kira. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks for helping to deliver that service to Washington communities. That's wonderful. Great. So we have left I would say, a decent amount of time for questions. So I'm excited for us to dig in, and I'm going to turn over to my colleague Gabby to help us walk through some of the questions that have come in the Q&A. We'd like you to submit those in the chat box or in the Q&A box so that we can get to those questions. So Gabby, why don't you jump off mute and lead us off here?
Sounds good. Thanks, Sarah. Like Sarah said, my name is Gabby. I'm with Undaunted K-12 and will be moderating the rest of the call for Q&A. So a lot of great questions have already come in. So I'll start with the first one that came in. How do ground source heat pumps perform in the colder winter temperatures of Eastern Washington, specifically for one-story K-12 school buildings? Ron, would you like to maybe start off here?
Yes, that sounds good. Yeah, so the good news is ground source heat pumps are unaffected by the outdoor temperature, so it's a great technology for Eastern Washington. The heating loads in Eastern Washington are larger than Western Washington, so your system's going to be larger, but it's going to be designed that way by the design team, and then once it's designed with enough capacity for your school, it will not be impacted by a cold snap, because the ground's going to keep a steady temperature.
Great, thank you. And Ron, this next question might also be most relevant for you. Can ground source heat pumps be integrated with radiant floor systems?
Yes. Yeah, the nice thing about radiant floor systems is they do not require very warm water. So heat pumps have a very easy time creating the temperatures needed by those systems, because they're looking for cooler water. The more challenging ones are like a legacy, say a 50-year-old school that had a gas boiler at 180 degrees. That can be a challenge for a ground source heat pump. So what we do in those cases is potentially replace heating coils with larger heating coils, or run some what we call a stress test to see if your existing coils can handle the lower temperatures that a ground source system would produce for water temperatures.
Taylor, do you want to add anything there?
No, Ron's got it right on the head. The lower temperatures, we do have some sites with radiant floors, which are a great source for us, right? We're thinking of those sites for retrofits, but yeah, the existing building retrofits are challenging in that way because of the water temperature difference. So yeah.
Okay. So this next question maybe is something that we can take offline. I'm not sure if us on the call would be the best answer, but I'll share it out just in case and see if anyone can add anything here. Are there any examples of combining an OSPI small school district modernization grant with this ITC incentive for ground source heat pumps?
I'm happy to speak generally about stackability because I see another question there about stacking these things with other grant funds and incentives. And it's one of the pieces that I didn't go into in depth in the presentation. So this is a good prompt to do so. So in general, these tax credits play very well with other sources of funding. There are two rules to keep in mind. So one way in which they play nice, remember we talked about this tax credit is calculated based on a cost basis. How much did you spend? Remember my $10 million example and a 30% tax credit. If you get a grant for, say, $1 million against that, the cost basis, in other words, the basis on which you calculate your tax credit is still $10 million, even if you get that $1 million grant. So it doesn't reduce your cost basis. So that's positive and a good thing. Which means you could combine a bunch of these kind of grant and different funding opportunities. The only place where it starts to bite is if you start to get project-specific grants. So someone gives you a grant in that same example, $10 million HVAC system, ground source heat pump system, and someone gives you a $9 million grant for a ground source heat pump system. So it's a specified use grant. Then if you got a $3 million tax credit, you'd be making money. And the IRS says, no, we're going to reduce that tax credit down to just $1 million. So that's somewhat of gives you a flavor of how the IRS thinks about how tax credits play with other sources of funding. But in general, think of this as it's being treated as cash back to your institution. And so in general, it tends to really play well with other sources of funding. And I don't know if others have any thoughts specifically on the grant program from OSPI.
Okay.
Oh,
Oh, go ahead, Kira.
yeah, I was just gonna chime in. I don't have anything about OSPI, but if you are, if you do have a grant that you are working with and you are not sure, is this restricted, unrestricted? So project specific would be restricted, like Sarah was saying. That's something that we can help you out and review through SETCAP. So, we can, after signing a retention letter with, our attorneys, we can review your grant documentation and, be able to determine if it is a restricted grant or not, and then, go from there to see how much you would be likely to qualify for. And there's other, projects or grant specific rules and restrictions that we can discuss. And I'll drop some of our guidance briefs in this chat just so that you can take a look if grants are something that you're working with for your projects.
Thanks, Kira. So this next question is generally about retrofitting ground source heat pumps into existing schools, and not a specific question, but maybe we can just share a little bit more about what that looks like, and also anything about how the tax credit plays into that. Ron or Taylor, would you have any thoughts more on the technical side about what it's like retrofitting this technology into existing schools?
Ron, do you want to go first?
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I'll go first. So Sarah, I do have some slides, or I could also just talk through some of the considerations, but we've already mentioned the water temperature one. The other one is electrical capacity is a big one. And so typically a traditional, like if you're building a new school, you've got, your schematic design, design development, construction documents, it doesn't really follow that path when we're looking at something like this. We really identify those high risk items early on and try to tackle those. So for instance, on the electrical side, we like to deploy 30-day metering early in the development, see how much spare electrical capacity there is, because certainly if you were burning natural gas to heat and now you're going to use electricity to heat through a heat pump, we need to know how much spare capacity there is. And then the other thing that gets moved to the front is talking to the electric utility to see how much electricity they can provide. What is their transformer capable of, their feeders to the site. So that's something that's different about this kind of project versus a typical project, is the electrical capacity. And then one other thing is when we talked about running that stress test, the nice thing about an existing school is you can see what the real heating load is. Because if this school was designed 40 years ago, probably it was oversized. Because you've got a steam boiler or a gas boiler or hot water boilers that are too big. And since it's an existing building, we can actually measure what is the real load during cold weather. So the best time to do that preliminary work is during cold weather, say the year before you want to install it. And then we can see, oh, this existing system was 50% oversized. And that can make a big difference on the feasibility of the heat pump upgrade.
Yeah, and I'll just add too, space constraints are a big issue for us in Seattle. We have, you have to have space to put the wells. We have a site right now that's under construction that we had to put them under the building, which is something you can only do when there is no building, right? So if you don't have the space for the loops or the ground source loops, that can be a problem. But also within the facility, replacing, 2 condensing boilers with 5 or 6 heat pumps, you have to have space within the site, within the mechanical room, just to put that stuff as well. So considerations there as well.
Yeah, that's a good one. I wanted to tag on to that too with open loop. It's really expensive to drill a test well for open loop. So one thing we try to do really early on for an existing building is to do what we call a desk study with a geohydrologist to see what is the aquifer like underneath the school grounds and what is the likelihood that you've got a good source of water. So just so everyone knows, you can do closed loop anywhere. All schools will work with closed loop, but only certain schools work with open loop. So that's something we like to figure out early.
Sarah, do you have anything to add there? There's
No.
actually great. So on that topic, Ron, there's a question specifically on open loop and closed loop systems. Peter asks, are open loop ground source heat pump systems more expensive to maintain than closed loop systems?
Yes. Yeah. It's not a large number, but it is more expensive to maintain an open loop system. So, somewhere in the life, you're going to have a pump replacement. Think of it as like a rural drinking water well. The same type of maintenance that you would have to do on a drinking water well is the type of maintenance you would have to do on an open loop system. We always use heat exchangers to protect the heat pump. So the heat pump doesn't know that it's open loop, so the heat pump's fine and everything inside the school is fine. But the heat exchanger itself, will need to be cleaned. So that's a consideration. I'm sorry, the heat exchanger, yeah.
Great. Taylor, this next question specifically for you. Ground source heat pumps is a fairly rare mechanical system type, mostly due to drilling costs. Why wouldn't you do a cold weather optimized central air source heat pump system instead?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly sites that we don't have the space or the capacity to add wells. So we do have some sites that already have airside heat pumps. But honestly, those systems are more problematic than our ground source systems because, like Ron mentions, the ground is consistent. The air is not. So our air source heat pumps actually have a really hard time in colder weather. But in any case, we always, our loops have an electric boiler backup. So if we run out of capacity in the ground for some reason, or there's an issue there, we can add BTUs with a backup boiler just in case. So there's some flexibility there. But generally speaking, the air source heat pumps are more problematic for us in that way. So we found ground source systems, even when it's, we've had some really cold weather this last winter. And when we were in the teens, those buildings were doing really well. So whereas the air source buildings, we almost had to close. So, we've had a lot more reliability with the ground source systems for sure.
Thanks, Taylor. So,
Yeah, now,
oh, go ahead, jump in, please.
okay, add you real quick to that is, I definitely think, ground source is the best, but if ground source doesn't fit with your budget, even with the tax credit factored in, air source heat pumps are a good solution. They're not a bad solution. And I think the person who asked the question mentioned the term cold climate heat pump, and that is certainly something that's available now that was not very available 10 years ago that really helps air source heat pumps. So yeah, ground source is the best, but air source is still good.
Yeah, nothing against air source by any means. If you can do it, you should do it. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm seeing two questions come in that are both related to the tax credit. So Sarah, maybe I'll kick this over to you and tag on Matt's earlier in the chat. So the first question is, does the 30% tax credit typically cover the cost premium for ground source heat pumps over air source heat pumps or VRF? And then Matt dropped in the chat a question about replacement ground source heat pump units for existing systems. So maybe if you can speak to how the tax credit is handled in those situations as well.
Great. Yeah. So the pattern that we see across the country is in fact that the 30% tax credit covers not only the premium associated with drilling the well field for the ground source system, so vis-a-vis air source or VRF, another heat pump system, but actually that it can make ground source heat pumps the lowest first cost to install, in new construction specifically. We're even seeing that pattern crop up in some cases in retrofits. Now, retrofits, every building is a snowflake. So, every set of circumstances will be their own circumstances with their own associated costs. But I would encourage folks to think about, ground source heat pump systems may actually be the lowest first cost to install, beating out even code minimum gas boilers. That it's what we're seeing across the country, really very consistently in a whole bunch of states. So it's quite striking. And knowing that you can get 40 like Seattle did for using domestic content, or even 50%, of course, that'll make it even more so the case. So replacement units for existing systems, there is, you can get the tax credit for repairing an existing system. There are some details there about, you have to be doing a pretty substantial renovation. There's something called the 80/20 rule. So Matt, if you want to follow up with one of us, we can get you more details. Or actually, that would be a great thing to take to office hours, to the SETCAC team to talk about that 80/20 rule. But yes, there are circumstances where replacing existing systems can generate a new tax credit.
Awesome. So we have hit time as I started speaking. And so I see that there was an anonymous question left about being in a seismic area and how that might affect pushback. So Ron or Taylor, if you want to very quickly respond to any pushback you may have seen on this technology in a seismic area, feel free to share, and then we'll close out.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I haven't heard of any seismic constraints that we've had at SPS. Most of our constraints have just been site size or what's below the building, right? So no seismic concerns that I'm aware of, but I'll let Ron speak to more of that, I guess.
Yeah, never on closed loop, but on open loop, I know that does come up, and the geohydrologist who's involved will look at what is the risk for that particular site. And the risk would be that you lose your aquifer production. but that is something that a geohydrologist will evaluate as part of the project design.
Great.
Great. Thank you.
I'll just a quick close out. Thank all of our speakers for being here. It was wonderful to have your expertise and knowledge. We really appreciate you coming to share. And thanks for all of you who joined us today. We hope this was helpful and that you'll go and think about your next new construction or end of life heating or cooling opportunities to incorporate this technology. So thanks so much for being here. Take care.